Okay, hi everyone. We're going to talk about chapter 34, which is digestive systems. For some reason, my computer is not letting me play the slideshow. I'll try one more time. It's not, so we're just going to keep it under this view here. Actually, I'll zoom in a little bit more. Hopefully that'll help a little bit. Yeah. So that's the best we can get, and you guys can look under slideshow obviously as you're playing this, I guess, too, to follow along. But hopefully this will be okay. So we're going to talk, just like the other chapters were organized, we're going to talk about some digestive systems or digestive tracts in, other organisms besides humans, but most of the chapter will focus on the human digestive system. And then we'll finish by talking a little bit about nutrition and human health. So again, you guys probably know most of the stuff. We talk about basic function of the digestive system. It's going to provide the body with nutrients, right? So we were talking about homeostasis before, and remember there was that table that, talked to you about what homeostatic function each system, what function I guess each system plays in terms of homeostasis. So obviously we're talking about homeostasis, and we're talking about maintenance of nutrient levels and what have you. And so if you talk about function of the digestive system, ingest food, again, I'm sure we all know this, breaks down food into smaller molecules, and then those smaller molecules are then able to cross plasma membranes and then essentially enter into the bloodstream, right? And so once the food is broken down into that digestive tract, it gets absorbed, okay? And that primarily will happen in the small intestine, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then obviously anything that's not going to be absorbed will get eliminated out, okay? And so if we talk about what it includes, we're going to, we talk about the organs, tissues, and any, cells that are involved in ingesting food and breaking it down, okay? So again, primary functions of the digestive system. All right, so here's where we're going to talk a little bit about incomplete versus complete tracts. Again, we talked about this before, okay? So if we talk about an incomplete digestive tract, it has one single opening. That single opening is used for entrance of food and also for exit of waste. So our example is planaria. Remember, food will enter through that mouth and that muscular pharynx. And remember, in lab, we put some egg yolk in the dish, and you can kind of see how they wrap their bodies around that egg yolk to eat. They have a gastrovascular cavity, that the food goes into. Waste will also exit through the mouth. Okay, again, incomplete, one single opening, and also doesn't have any specialized parts. Now, in contrast to that, if you have a complete digestive tract, two openings, right? And so our simple example of that actually is an earthworm, okay? And again, you guys did this dissection in lab. So food will enter through the mouth, waste will exit through the anus, so it's not one single opening, just like planaria, you have two openings. And there's also a specialization of parts that you see. So remember when we did the earthworm, I pointed out things like the crop and the gizzard, and then you can see the intestine, and so you can see that these specialized parts were not part of the planaria. So the planaria, obviously, an incomplete digestive tract is more simple than a complete digestive tract. Right, and so this is just showing you a picture here. Again, you can see the mouth, the pharynx, and the digestive tract of the planaria, and they have this sort of gastrovascular cavity, right? So there's no intestines or stomach or specialized parts, okay? So this is showing you once this food is broken down, it's then going to enter into a cell, right, and get absorbed. If you talk about the earthworm, a little more complex. You can see, again, two openings, and then you can see that there are specialized parts, okay? You guys have seen this before. Again, you really just should know the difference between incomplete and complete, and you should also be able to give an example of an organism that has an incomplete digestive tract versus a complete. Also, when you talk about some of these other organisms, one thing that you might distinguish between them is whether they're continuous or discontinuous feeders. Obviously we're discontinuous feeders, although maybe some of us continue to eat all the time, but pretty much we're discontinuous feeders, right? Continuous feeders are filter feeders, and we talked about examples of that when we were going through all of these different types of organisms. So one example is clams. I'm sure you guys can think of some other examples of filter feeders as well, right? So they always have water moving into their cavity, and essentially they're trapping whatever is in that water, okay? And so that's how they're eating. They're not going to grab any prey and put it into their mouth. They are simply, continuously feeding with whatever is coming through that water, okay? So it says they don't need a food storage area, right? Because they're not eating big particles or anything like that. They're these filter feeders. As opposed, in contrast to that, squid, right? We talked about these guys before, that they have this sort of beak-like jaws where they can actually, tear and rip their prey. And the squid is able to move pretty quickly to actually grab its prey. So it's saying there that it can move quickly and also will use its tentacles to seize prey, and then it will pull pieces apart and basically put it into its mouth, okay? And obviously you need a food storage area there because you're taking in bigger particles at a time. So, in squid, you see a stomach, you see a cecum, which is essentially, part of that digestive tract, and basically the food will remain there until digestion is finished. Okay, and so if you look at some of the anatomy, again, I'm not going to hold you guys accountable for anatomy here, and we saw this already, but you can kind of see how, the different structures in the clam versus the squid in terms of these digestive organs that we talked about. Again, I'm not really going to ask you about digestive organs. I just want you to understand the difference between continuous and discontinuous and be able to give an example of each. Okay, so sorry, let me just kind of move this up a little bit. Yeah. All right, so now, again, these are things you guys already know. So we're, again, talking about some adaptations and differences in sort of things that are going to aid in digestion. So dentition is one of them. And so if you talk about the difference between being an omnivore versus an herbivore versus a carnivore, right, you're going to have different types of teeth in there, okay? So we should know the difference between omnivore, herbivore. Did I change the slide? Let me just make sure I didn't. 1 second. Yeah, sorry, I did. All right, so omnivores, again, we're omnivores, right? We obviously eat both vegetables and meat, or vegetation and meat. If you talk about some examples of invertebrate omnivores, clams, tube worms, again, I mentioned us, pigs, raccoons, bears, they're all omnivores, and you would have this specialized dentition to support that, okay? And now if we move on to talk about herbivores, right, they're only going to eat plants, so they have these specialized incisors that can clip off parts of the plants. They also then have sort of premolars and molars that are specialized for grinding. So examples, land snails, some insects are herbivores, so koalas will eat only eucalyptic leaves. If you think about horses, right, cattle, they will feed on grasses. And so I think we talked about ruminants before, right? And so like cattle, goats, and sheep, they have this 4-chambered stomach, right? So it allows them to eat that grass, chew it, goes into one part of the stomach, right? And then they basically regurgitate, it gets broken down a little bit more, they regurgitate it, and then they can swallow it down into that other stomach so that it's able to then be absorbed, right? So they have that specialization, there's special bacteria in there that can break down that cellulose. Remember, we can't break down cellulose. And so again, these ruminants have this, these resident bacteria that live in these sort of extra chambers that help them break that down. Okay, again, we talked about that before. Let's make sure I didn't miss anything here. Sorry for not being able to put this on the slideshow. Okay. So know what a ruminant is, right? We talk about carnivores. Obviously, these are only animals that eat other animals. They have these really pointy incisors and enlarged canines to be able to obviously grab their prey and eat it. I mean, remember we talked about the saber-toothed cat, right? Super, super huge or sort of adaptation in the teeth to be able to get its prey, okay? So dogs, lions, dolphins are all carnivores. I mean, we might want to argue that dogs aren't really carnivores anymore, right? Because we feed them they eat vegetables and stuff as well, but in the wild, okay? All right. Okay, and so again, if you look at, jaws and teeth of an omnivore versus an herbivore versus a carnivore, you can see the differences in dentition, right? So this is trying to point out these differences here, okay? Again, sorry about switching like that. Okay, the next part talks about human digestive tract, right? So we obviously know that our digestive tract is complete, right? It is a part of a tube within a tube body plan, okay? So it begins with the mouth, ends with the anus, and digestion, it says, is entirely extracellular, meaning, right, all that food is in the GI tract. It's being digested there. Then once it's digested, it will then be absorbed into the cells. Okay, so this is all happening outside of the cell. It's once it's absorbed and those minerals and nutrients are broken down to small molecules, that's when they can be absorbed into the cells. So it says it's mechanical as well as chemical. We're going to talk about that. Okay, when you think about mechanical, chewing, churning of the stomach, and when we think about chemical, we think about digestive enzymes. Okay, and so there are certain organs that will secrete different digestive enzymes, and particular enzymes will break down particular types of food, right? So you might have an enzyme that breaks down starches, an enzyme that breaks down fats, and we're going to talk about those. Okay. All right, so it says digestive enzymes are secreted by the wall of the digestive tract. Like I said, we're going to talk about this, and also nearby accessory glands. So we will talk about both. Now, this slide is a really good slide, right? So you guys are going to be responsible for knowing all of the organs of the human digestive tract and also accessory organs, okay? So remember that, so salivary glands, yes, of course, they're involved in digestion. They are not part of the digestive tract per se though, okay? But they do secrete digestive enzymes. So again, you might not be able to see this too well because the words are small. However, you guys can look at this and enlarge this on your own. Basically has almost all the information that we're going to cover here kind of in this nice, concise way, okay? It shows you all of the main organs of the digestive system and also accessory organs as well. Make sure you know the difference between accessory versus main organs. So on this side are the accessory organs, okay? On this side are the digestive tract organs. You can see it's kind of small the way it's written here, okay? Accessory organs, digestive tract. We're going to go through these now, but this is a super helpful slide to study from. Okay, so we start in the mouth, we're going to move all the way down. So mouth, digestion begins there. I'm sure we all know that. That's going to be mechanical digestion, right? And also chemical. Okay, so the mechanical obviously is the chewing. Your tongue aids in that. Your even the palate, the roof of the mouth. All of this is going to aid in this mechanical digestion. Obviously your teeth as well. Okay, so like I said, so you have mechanical digestion there. You also have the salivary glands, which secrete salivary amylase. You guys should know what that enzyme is, and you should know what it breaks down. Okay, so salivary amylase will break down starches. Okay, so it initiates starch digestion. Okay, and we talked about, starches. We think about potatoes, really high in starch. Okay, so starch digestion will begin in the mouth. All right, and this just focuses a little bit more on the tongue here. I think we all know what the tongue is and that it's muscular. Okay, and basically once all of this mechanical digestion and mixing with the saliva has occurred, you form something that's called a bolus. Okay, and then that's what you're going to swallow. All right, let's move on to that next slide. Okay, and so again, it's just kind of showing you when you swallow here that it goes into the back of the mouth, then you're swallowing it down, and you're hoping that that goes down into the esophagus, right? Because again, if it went down into the trachea, you would choke, right? The trachea leads to the lungs. Okay, so you can see here this epiglottis, right, will cover the glottis here, which will block the trachea. Okay. So when you swallow, this closes. If you're talking or, while eating, this might be open, and then that's how food might slip down in there. Okay, so don't talk while you eat. So now again, if we're just keep moving down further, right? So now we're going to talk about the pharynx and the esophagus. So at the pharynx, digestive and respiratory passages kind of come together, but then they separate, right? So like I just showed you in that picture, you want that bolus of food to go down into the esophagus, not into the trachea, and so that, into the glottis, right? So the epiglottis covers the glottis, which is the opening into the trachea, okay? So once it gets into the esophagus, that food will move down to the stomach by something called peristalsis. So this is a sort of muscular kind of squeezing that moves the food down slowly. Okay, so it tells you there. Rhythmical contraction to move contents into tubular organs. So we talked about smooth muscle, right? Smooth muscle being in organs. Well, smooth muscle lines the esophagus. That aids in getting that food down into the stomach. It doesn't just go kerplunk down into the stomach. Okay, so if we kind of continue on this, so if you kind of talk about, we kind of said the digestive system is a tube, right, within a tube. And so so this is kind of focusing on the layers, right? So imagine food's in your esophagus, right? It's like a tube. If you cut through that tube, just like you would just cut through like a hose, and then look at the cross section, okay? So the hole in the middle is called the lumen, okay, in the center, and then the wall is composed of these 4 characteristic layers: mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and serosa. Okay, and I told you that that movement of that food down there, that peristalsis, is due to muscle, smooth muscle. Okay, and so particularly that smooth muscle is located in this muscularis layer. Okay, so the serosa part of the internal lining of the is basically part of the peritoneum. So anyway, let's look at a picture here, right? So the serosa is the outermost one. So this is just telling you that this is part of the internal lining of the abdominal cavity, which is called the peritoneum. So you might have heard that that word before. Sorry, my phone is ringing. Okay, so again, let's look at that picture. Okay, so you should know that these are the 4 layers of the wall of the digestive tract. You should know what is the outermost layer, which is the serosa. Okay, and then you have serosa, you have what? Muscularis, and then mucosa, submucosa, and then mucosa, and then the lumen is in the middle there. Okay. So anyway, same thing, like I'm not going to show diagrams of this, but you should know these are the 4 layers. Okay, and again, this muscularis, it's smooth muscle. Contraction of that smooth muscle is what's moving that food down the esophagus. Okay, so again, here's the wall, right? Mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and serosa. So that's going from innermost to outermost layers here, the way they're listed there. Okay, just in case it's a little hard to see here. Okay, so this is again reiterating what we just showed you, right? Or what I just told you, talking about peristalsis and the movement of this bolus of food down the esophagus, right? So you kind of see this sort of, so this area will contract, it pushes it down further, and then, the next area will contract, that keeps pushing that food further and further along. Okay, so let's move on here. All right, so now we move down the esophagus. The next place your food's going to stop is in the stomach, okay? So you swallow that food, goes into the esophagus at the top. It's going to go all the way down until it reaches the stomach, okay? And so if you actually look at the stomach, it actually has these deep folds in there, okay? And so as the stomach fills, those folds sort of disappear and that stomach expands. If you talk about the epithelial lining, so remember we talked about epithelial tissue and epithelial cells that line organs, right, or cover. So in all of these organs, you'll have an epithelial lining. In the stomach, that epithelial lining has gastric pits, which actually have gastric glands. And these gastric glands secrete hydrochloric acid, right, and pepsin. Okay, so remember hydrochloric acid, it's an acid. So your stomach pH is about 2, okay, and so part of the reason why is because it can actually kill bacteria in food. So it goes into that highly acidic environment. If there's any bacteria there, then it will kill that bacteria. Again, I told you there's this an enzyme called pepsin, which is there, and this pepsin will start to break down proteins. Okay, so remember, you're eating the food, it's going into your digestive tract so that it can start to get broken down, right, and all into smaller molecules that eventually can be absorbed. So we said that the first part of digestion, or chemical digestion, right, is salivary amylase in the mouth. Now, once it gets into the stomach, right, pepsin is released, which will start breaking down proteins, okay? And pepsin, resides in the stomach. It works at a very, very low pH, so it's specialized to work at a pH of about 2 because it resides in the stomach. Okay, so this is showing you here, you can see this gastric pit of the stomach, and these are the cells that secrete the mucus. This is also showing you cells that will secrete the HCl and that pepsin that we talked about, okay? And this all kind of makes up that gastric gland, okay? So it's the whole gastric gland. This is the gastric pit here, and then you can see what there's specialized cells, some cells that will produce mucus, some that will produce the hydrochloric acid and the enzymes. Okay. if we keep continuing here with the stomach, basically again you have this layer of mucus. I showed you those mucus cells that protect the stomach from enzymatic action. So again, you have enzymes that are being released. Those enzymes are to break down the food, not to, you know, mess with the cells that are lining the stomach there. So one thing that can happen, right, is you can have reflux, right? Some people say they have acid reflux, right? And there's actually a disease called gastrointestinal reflux disease, or GERD, which will cause this heartburn, okay? And so sometimes this gastric acid will leak upward, and it gets irritated and it can cause this heartburn, okay? Now, when that food is mixing with these gastric juices that I just told you about, it becomes something called chyme, right? And so, and then what's going to happen, that is going to then move out of the stomach into the next organ, which is the small intestine, okay? So it says here, when the chyme entering the stomach starts a reflex, causes the sphincter at the stomach's base to basically contract and close the opening, right? However, once it relaxes, then a small amount of that chyme, which is food mixed with digestive, or the hydrochloric acid, the mucus, right, and the enzymes that it was secreted, now will move into the small intestine. Okay, so it has to be in the stomach for a little while to get that, you know, more digestion to occur, to get the food in contact with the pepsin and the mucus and the hydrochloric acid. Now it's ready to move into the small intestine. So again, it doesn't move in there all at once, right? It has this sphincter that controls the release of food from the stomach into the small intestine. Okay, so now next organ, right? So we went from the mouth, right, to the esophagus essentially. We kind of said pharynx and esophagus, and then we went to the stomach, and now we're in the small intestine. The first segment of the small intestine is called the duodenum. Okay, sometimes people say duodenum, whatever, duodenum I say. And so that's where that's where your food is going to enter from the stomach. That's the first part of the small intestine. Here, what will happen is that this chyme, right, from your stomach will mix with secretions from the liver and the pancreas, right? So remember I mentioned these accessory organs of the digestive tract. One we already talked about, which is salivary glands that secrete salivary amylase. Here are two others, so the liver and the pancreas. Now, the liver has other functions as well, but it also has a digestive function. Its function in digestion is the production of bile, okay? Bile is produced in the liver, but it is stored in the gallbladder. So I will repeat, the gallbladder does not produce bile, it only stores it. So again, liver produces the bile is stored in the gallbladder. Bile contains bile salts, which help break up the fat and basically emulsify the fat. Then there are other enzymes that will break down that fat further, okay? Okay, and also we're going to talk about the pancreas. So the pancreas will release specific enzymes as well. And the pancreas has a dual function too. Pancreas will secrete, you know, also secretes insulin and glucagon, you know, which are involved in maintaining blood glucose levels. However, it also has a digestive function. Okay, and so let's talk a little bit more about the pancreas, right? So like I said, we said it has both an endocrine function, right, in terms of making hormones like glucagon and insulin. However, it also has a digestive role, and so we call that the exocrine part of it, okay? So it secretes pancreatic juice and digestive enzymes into the small intestine, right? And also the small intestine, enzymes of the small intestine also will produce, cells of the small intestine will also produce digestive enzymes as well, okay? So you have a lot of enzymes entering the small intestine to get in contact with that food that just came from the stomach, because you want to complete all of that digestion at that point so that once it moves further along in that small intestine, now absorption of nutrients can occur, okay? All right, now this brings us to this, right? So again, once digestion has finished, right, all of the food's broken down into all those smaller molecules, now it's ready to be absorbed. Again, that will happen in the small intestine, and so there are modifications of the small intestine to allow this to happen. So there are villi, okay, on the surface, and then microvilli. So again, if you think about the inside of the small intestine, you'll see there are these projections that increase that surface area, okay? And so there are still digestive enzymes there as well. So you want to make sure all that digestion has occurred, and then you can start absorbing, okay? So again, the villi and the microvilli are modifications to that small intestine wall that increase the surface area, okay? And so if you look here again, I told you this is, right, this is the lumen, this is very inside. If you zoom in on it, you can see these projections, okay? If you look at one villi, you also then have microvilli on that villi, right? So here's your villi, and then you zoom in and you can see the microvilli there. Again, increasing surface area. All right, so from the small intestine, you move into the large intestine, okay? And so these are the divisions of the large intestine, okay? So the reason why it's called large intestine is that it's larger in diameter, but it's actually shorter in length than the small intestine. This part of the large intestine, the cecum, has the small projection called the appendix, okay? So that's where the appendix comes from. The job of the large intestine, so the small intestine really particularly, if you think about one job, is involved in absorbing nutrients, right? Whereas the large intestine is going to absorb water, salts, and also some vitamins, okay? It will also store any undigestible material until it's eliminated as feces. There is actually a really large population of bacteria there too, and so these bacteria are in that large intestine to break down any other indigestible material, but also there to actually produce vitamins, okay? So bacteria in the large intestine produce vitamin K, which is needed for clotting, okay? So, you know, we have many examples of bacteria that are needed within our bodies in order for normal function. So I kind of skipped here, but you have the colon, which will join the rectum, and it's the last 20 centimeters of that large intestine, okay? Again, anything that's not digested will leave through that last opening there, the anus. Okay, so this is just showing you a picture here, right? So large intestine, this is showing you the small intestine going into the large intestine, and then just kind of showing you that appendix, which is just a sort of outpocketing of this part of the large intestine. Okay, so just to reiterate on these accessory organs, all right? So we've hit on a few of them as we move through. Remember we talked about the pancreas. I didn't specifically talk about what enzymes it releases, okay? So again, remember that it has endocrine function, which is secreting insulin and glucagon, hormones. We're not concerned about that right now because we're now talking about digestion. But the pancreas also has an exocrine function, okay? So pancreatic juice and digestive enzymes, like I talked about before. So in the pancreatic juice, there's sodium bicarbonate in there, okay? Because remember that that food or that chyme coming from the stomach is highly acidic, right? It has a pH of about 2. When it gets into that small intestine, it needs to be neutralized. That pH needs to become, you know, closer to neutral, about pH of 7. So the pancreatic juice does that, okay? Here are some of the enzymes that are released. So pancreatic amylase. Remember we had salivary amylase. Amylase digests starch. So there's more starch digestion that will occur here. Trypsin, also produced by the pancreas, will digest proteins. Okay, we had another one, pepsin, in the stomach, right? That was going to digest protein. Well, now this will further digest proteins. Lipase will digest fat. Remember we talked about bile that's produced from the liver will help emulsify the fat, but then it actually gets further broken down by the lipase that's secreted by the pancreas. Okay, again, liver we talked about already. It is considered an accessory organ. Again, it has many other functions, but in digestion, its function is the production of bile. Okay, and this is just showing you where it's located. You guys remember when you did the frog dissection, how big the liver is, right, in the abdominal cavity. Also, when you do the fetal pig, you'll see that again. Okay, this is showing you kind of, or talking about the sort of anatomy, I guess, and kind of how it's set up. We mentioned a little bit about this portal vein and the hepatic vein system. To be honest, you don't have to, I'm not going to ask you about this, okay, in terms of that setup and how that stuff works. I want you just to know the functions. One, the digestive function of the liver, and then also some of these other functions that are listed here, okay? I could ask you to list, you know, 4 functions of the liver, okay? Detoxification of the blood, storage of iron and some vitamins. You can see there's a wide variety of functions. But if I ask you what its function is in digestion, you would tell me that it's the production of bile. These are all other functions that are involved in other systems, not necessarily in digestion. However, you guys should know these as well, okay? Production of plasma proteins, regulation of blood glucose levels, right? So it's stored in the liver, glucose is stored as glycogen, right? And then if the body needs glucose, it will break down the glycogen to get glucose. Production of urea, removal and storage of iron and vitamins, production of bile, like we said, removal of bilirubin, right? If you get a buildup of bilirubin, you can have this sort of yellow color and have something called jaundice, and it's also involved in regulating blood cholesterol levels. Okay, so lots and lots of functions of the liver. So I just mentioned this, right? So if you talk about liver disorders, jaundice, right? You get yellowing of the skin due to excess bilirubin. Sometimes you'll see this happens in infants. Another one, hepatitis, which is inflammation, right? Hence the name, hepatitis, inflammation of the liver. A lot of times it's caused by a virus. Also cirrhosis, right? So this is common in alcoholics. It's scarring of the liver tissue. And if you have enough scarring, it leads to reduced function. You guys saw all those functions that the liver does, so it's super important that it's functioning properly, okay? So it says the liver is actually able to regenerate in some cases, which is really something that I'm not sure we totally understand, but in some cases, and depending on how much is lost, or if there's just a little bit, it can actually regenerate some of its part. You're not going to be able to like regenerate an entire liver, but part of it can actually regenerate. Okay, we mentioned gallbladder again. What does it do? It stores excess bile, right? So this is all reiterating things that we already kind of talked about. Okay, this is just showing you a picture there. Remember I told you, you don't have to worry about these ducts or any of the anatomy of this here. But again, this kind of puts things into perspective here. You can see the gallbladder. Remember that it looked like a little balloon when we saw it in the frog. Here's your liver here. Remember, bile is produced in the liver and then goes into the gallbladder to be stored. And then this is just showing you kind of the pancreatic duct and this all being released into the small intestine here, right? Because we basically said, you know, the food is in the small intestine, right? But all of these other accessory organs are secreting enzymes that need to come in contact with that food, right? And so they release them into the small intestine, okay? And again, I told you don't worry about this part here when we're talking about the hepatic artery and that anatomy there. All right. The last part of this is nutrition and human health. We know a lot about this. I think there's things that are kind of common, or things that we commonly talk about, and we talked about this before. So we talk about carbohydrates, okay, present in the form of sugars, starch, and fiber, right? Glucose, right? Carbohydrate. Disaccharides like lactose and sucrose are carbohydrates, okay? So fruits, vegetables, milk, and honey are natural sources of sugars or carbohydrates. Okay, so we should know examples of carbohydrates. What happens to, you know, in terms of digestion, if you're talking about carbohydrates, so it says after being absorbed from the digestive tract, right, all sugars are converted into glucose. Yeah, they have to be broken down into glucose. And then that glucose can be used for production of ATP by cellular respiration. If all of that glucose doesn't need to be used, and that's very much usually the case, it gets stored, okay, as glycogen in animals. Remember, this gets stored in the liver, and in plants, they will store glucose as starch, okay? Yeah, so we just said this. Yeah? I'm fine. You don't need to come in. Sorry about that. Okay, so the other thing is too fiber, right? So it says includes various indigestible carbohydrates. So like we talked about cellulose, right? And that ruminants have a special way of being able to break down cellulose. Well, we can't, right? So this is sort of, think of that as fiber. It's still important to eat fiber, okay? Because it's not a nutrient, it can't be digested. However, it helps get things out and push things through that GI tract that need to, you know, to move out through the feces. Okay, so that's why it says it adds bulk to the fecal material. Super important. Okay, so again, you're not getting nutrition from it, but it's super important for proper function of the digestive system. You need to be able to digest your foods, but you also need to eliminate the waste. Okay. All right. Next, you know, lipids. Okay, we talked about lipids, fats, oils, cholesterol, okay? And we talked about this before when we talked about biomolecules, right? Saturated fats versus unsaturated fats, okay? So saturated fats are solids at room temperature. Things like butter, meat, whole milk, those are all saturated. Unsaturated fats, plant oils, right? Like olive oil, vegetable oil, sunflower oil, those are all unsaturated fats, okay? And cholesterol says can be synthesized in the body, and it's also found in animal foods as well. Proteins, okay? Remember that proteins are made up of 20 different amino acids. And remember that some amino acids are required in your diet, right? So you have non-essential amino acids that your body can make on its own, right? Non-essential can make on its own. And then you have 9 essential amino acids. So what does it mean to be essential? It means you need to eat these amino acids so that your body has them to be able to make all the proteins that it needs to make. Okay, so it says, so some foods such as meat, milk, eggs, and whatever, they provide all 9. Okay, there are other foods that only have some of those essential amino acids. Okay, so it's important to have a varied diet because you need to make sure you get all of these amino acids, right? Like it's not okay to just have 18 of the 20 amino acids. You need all 20 in order for your body to function properly. And the last couple slides just talk about diet. Obviously, if you're talking about digestive system and diet, you would probably talk a little bit about obesity. There are many things that are you have an increased risk for if you are obese. So it says consumption of excess amount of calories from any source contributes to body fat. Obviously, this will put you at an increased risk of obesity. One particular disease that's tied to obesity is type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. Okay. There's a sort of quick way of sort of measuring kind of obesity using this BMI. Not sure that it's the best indicator of obesity because it only takes into account your weight essentially by height, so it doesn't take into account muscle mass compared to fat content and what have you. But apparently if you use BMI as an estimator, it's about 30% of Americans are actually obese. All right, so if you talk a little bit more about diabetes, so type 2 diabetes, okay, it says it occurs when the hormone insulin is not functioning properly, okay? So they say sometimes it's called insulin resistance. So bottom line is you end up with, a whole bunch of glucose in your blood, right? Your blood glucose levels are high, and also consequently your urine levels are super high, and meaning that the glucose is not able to get inside your cells, okay? So insulin's job is to take glucose from the blood and bring it inside your cell so that it can be used to produce ATP, right? And used for energy. If you have high glucose levels in the urine or in the blood, it indicates that your body is not able to take that glucose in, and it's super, super dangerous, right? And so that, type 2, again, diabetes is really due to kind of this hormone not functioning properly. If you talk about type 1, it's usually because your body doesn't produce insulin, okay? And so type 1 diabetics usually are diagnosed early on in life. Type 2 is something that's usually tied to obesity and can be reversed. But type 1, that's not the case, okay? So type 1, you can do insulin injections, or you have an insulin pump that basically regulates those insulin levels. And again, it's life-threatening, right? We already talked about cardiovascular disease in the last lecture, but again, it's connected with obesity, right? And so we're kind of bringing this up again. And I mentioned this too, the difference between LDL, low density lipoproteins, and HDL in terms of cholesterol, right? You want the high density, the HDL, the LDL is bad. But again, this is affected by your diet, okay? And so if you're eating tons of saturated fat and cholesterol, it's going to put you at an increased risk for cardiovascular disease, okay? It says American Heart Association says that diets high in saturated fats raise LDL, and obviously unsaturated fats will lower it, right? And so again, your diet can affect these levels. These aren't all just sort of, just characteristic genetic traits. A lot of cardiovascular disease has to do with lifestyle, okay? And finally, last slide here, talking about obviously you need vitamins and minerals, right? You have to take those in. And you can take them as long as you eat a healthy, sort of varied diet. You're going to get all the vitamins and minerals that you need. So vitamins are organic compounds that the body's unable to produce, right? But they're required for metabolic purposes. So a lot of times they are cofactors for enzymes, okay? So if you're missing a particular vitamin, it leads to a disorder. Minerals, again, are needed for various physiological functions. That's what it says here. So in terms of iron, super important for carrying oxygen around, right? So if you have low iron levels, you might have low hemoglobin levels, right? Low blood cell counts, and so that's all corresponding there. And so, but equally as important, calcium, magnesium, zinc, you need all of those minerals as well. Okay, and there's been this sort of, if you can have too much sodium, it can contribute to hypertension. So you can see how minerals are also super important to the function of the body as well. Okay, so that's it for this lecture. Sorry for the housekeeper knocking on my door. So I'm in a hotel room right now. All right, guys. So hopefully everything is clear. I will upload a quiz in the next couple days so that you guys can test your knowledge on the digestive system. Thanks.